Very warm welcome to our first panel session of the day. Is uncertainty the new normal for business? Now, originally, we'd planned this to be very much a session around COVID, but as you just heard Sir David Ramsden say, really, at the moment, all of the uncertainty that's out in this world is really indivisible, and there are lots of complex interrelationships that are happening between Brexit and COVID and the energy price rises and indeed some really very serious matters that are happening on the geopolitical stage. So we've got a lot to cover this morning in the hour or so that we've got, and we do stand between you and lunch, so we will get cracking. Now look, it seems to me that farmers are more adept to dealing with uncertainty than most, and well, let's face it, they've got the British weather to contend with, although 3 named storms in less than a week seems to me to be taking the mickey, really. But look, as you saw in the opening video this morning, we've got a fantastic set of entrepreneurs, but also people who are marketeers, agronomists, accountants, that the people in this room, I'm talking to my panel at this point, the people that we have in this room are incredibly skilled and incredibly resilient. But even so, it seems to me that having worked in this industry for over 25 years, I can never remember a time quite like this. It's an extraordinary time to be in business. It's an extraordinary time to be trying to feed the nation, just to reflect on what the President said earlier on. Anyway, we have a remarkable panel to think about this. I'm joined this morning by figures from with backgrounds in politics, business, broadcasting and regulation. And starting on my right, we've got Jim McMahon, who is the Shadow Environment, Food and Rural Affairs Secretary and Chair of Labour's sister party, the Cooperative Party. Now, Jim was first appointed to the Shadow Cabinet in April 2020, when he was made Shadow Transport Secretary. Before becoming MP for Oldham West and Royton, Jim was an apprentice technician. He worked in local government and he was a councillor. Next to Jim is award-winning author, broadcaster and political commentator Iain Dale. Now, although Iain's CV is richly embroidered with politics, broadcasting and publishing, he was actually brought up on an arable farm in Essex, and which he now owns with his 2 sisters. But he's probably best known these days for the evening show which he presents on LBC. He also writes for the Daily Telegraph, and he appears regularly on TV and co-presents for the Many podcast. On my immediate left is Jimmy McLoughlin, OBE, a former advisor to the Prime Minister on technology and entrepreneurship, perhaps during more sober times in number 10, and an old friend.
Didn't feel like that at the time, Terry.
But anyways, and an old friend of the NFU.
No, do you?
No, now, these days, Jimmy is a podcaster. He hosts the Jimmy's Jobs of the Future podcast, and that explores the future of the economy through the prism of jobs. And when he's not talking to those CEOs, when he's not talking to the Chancellor, as he was last month, he's right at the heart of the campaign to save Derby County Football Club. And if we've got time, we might get onto that. There's a few Rams fans in the audience, very good. And last but by no means least, Professor Susan Jebb. Now, Susan joins us today in her role as Chair of the Food Standards Agency, the independent government department working to protect public health and consumers' wider interest in relation to food in England, Wales and Northern Ireland. Susan is one of the country's leading scientists based at the University of Oxford, and her recent research has focused on the treatment of obesity and interventions to cover and encourage healthy and sustainable diets. Conference, please welcome our panel. So, all of you, a very warm welcome to NFU Conference. I've seen you eagerly taking in the first 2 plenary sessions and keeping an eye on the President and the Deputy Governor. So hopefully we can pick up on some of what they've said. But look, to the audience, there are 3 parts to our session today. I've got some questions for the panel. To NFU members in the audience, please start to try and find your mics. If you have a burning question for our panellists, or there's something that you've reflected on from this morning you'd like their view on, we have got NFU colleagues that are manning the 4 mics in the room, and they'll be able to notify me that you're there through the iPad. But to kick things off, I'd like to ask each of our panellists to provide our audience with some opening thoughts. You've been with us all morning. You've heard, as I said, Minette, you've heard the Deputy Governor, and then we've got a Cabinet Minister joining us after lunch. Just wondered, Jim, could we start with you for some opening remarks, and then we'll hear from the rest of the panel?
Of course. Well, I mean, first of all, thank you for the invitation. It's a great pleasure to be here. And also, of course, follow Sir Keir Starmer, who addressed your conference last year. And also to say thank you for all the work that you've been doing in very difficult circumstances to keep the country moving, to make sure that there is food on our tables in what has been extremely difficult circumstances. And for the leadership that you have shown for the industry, but also I think for British PLC, I think has been outstanding. So thank you for all of that. The exam question for this session, as far as I understood, was, is uncertainty the new normal? There was always going to be a degree of uncertainty that came with Brexit naturally. We were making a transition, it was a new relationship, there would be new rules and regulation in place that naturally we'd have to adapt to. Then the pandemic came and doubled down on that insecurity, doubled down on the uncertainty. That would have been bad enough, although I would say far too often the government were missing in action when it came to making sure that there was a coherent plan for Brexit, certainly. But to make matters worse, the change was doubled down on. So you had the pandemic, you had Brexit, you've then got inflation and the cost of living crisis, and you'll know more than I will the real impact that has on household bills, but on your business as well. And then you get the ELMS scheme changed all at the same time. And it just strikes me, trying to keep your head above water, trying to plan ahead when there's so much change and turmoil is extremely difficult. At the same time, I don't see any acknowledgement from the government about the true impact that Brexit has caused and the ability to separate out ideology from pragmatism and having the solutions to some of the everyday problems that you face. So where is the plan to address the lost exports of 2.4 billion in the first 3 quarters of last year? Where is the plan to put labour on the fields and bring across the butchers that we need to produce the food and get them to the supermarkets? Where is a plan to make sure that we have a proper buy British and your Labour's committed to buy, make and sell more in Britain, when there are trade deals being struck around the world that actively seek to undermine British producer interests? And I think all of that environment that you are being expected to operate in is very difficult. I think there are things that the government can do to make it much easier. First of all, use the power of procurement. You know, we know that we spend over £2 billion in food procurement across the public sector, in schools, hospitals, the prison service and more. But there isn't a coherent plan to make sure that we advantage British producers here in the UK. We see a cost of living crisis coming our way, and it's going to get a lot worse before it gets better, and you've heard some of that from the Bank of England earlier on. But where is the plan to make sure, on one hand, you're not undermined by the trade deals that have been signed already, but also the natural consumer drive to want to reduce supermarket prices as people begin to feel the pressure? So we've already seen Asda that have moved away from their pledge only to stock British beef, now to move to Ireland. Will supermarkets go even further as consumers demand that supermarket prices are lessened even further? And what does that mean? And what's the government doing to manage the cost of inflation that you're seeing on your raw materials, on your labour, on your energy costs, on distribution costs, on packaging costs? We just don't see a coherent plan for government to do that. And there are areas where we can agree. We believe strongly that ELMS could be made to work and could be a positive for this country. But we don't believe that you can reform that type of payment by only having the same pot of money available. There is too much demand on that single pot of money that will materially impact on the ability of some farms to be able to survive and wash their own face. On the other hand, we see firms in the City of London, in the Shard, that are using carbon offsetting funds to buy up family farms in whole swathes of the country as a way of planting non-native trees, reducing the amount of production land. But where's the plan from the government to make sure that they have a single plan about land use, diversification, biodiversity and nature? And one thing that Labour would absolutely do is to make sure, one, that we reduce uncertainty, that we have a coherent plan that transcends all government departments, and that you are in the driving seat for that, because there is nobody who knows better than people in this room what's needed to put it right.
Jim, thank you very much. We'll be quizzing you on what will be in that plan shortly. But before we come to questions, Iain Dale.
Shall we spice it up a bit?
Well,
What is this obsession with this word plan? I mean, we've had plan after plan after plan in all sections of the economy, generally generated by civil servants who haven't got a clue what they're doing.
We can agree on
and
that.
they don't work. The subject of this session is uncertainty the new norm for business? Well, when hasn't it been the norm, frankly? One of my first memories was when we joined the EEC in 1973. My father had, and I still have, a 228-acre arable farm in Essex. At that point, we produced beef cattle. Virtually as soon as we entered the EEC, he and many other farmers like him were effectively forced to sell because of the Common Agricultural Policy, which was a policy, a plan, designed for the benefit of French farmers and nobody else. So I am delighted we are out of the Common Agricultural Policy, and of course that leads to uncertainty in the short term, but it provides an opportunity for this country to decide where it wants to go. Now, things have been thrown off course, completely admit that, by the pandemic. The drop in exports, I mean, how do we know what's due to the pandemic, what is due to Brexit? And I'm not pretending that Brexit is a panacea. There have been all sorts of problems, and Minette alluded to the problems in the pig industry. And I have got no solution to those problems, and that is why you want government to intervene. You're absolutely right on that. But to pretend that government can provide certainty, I just think is for the birds. The great thing about this country, its farming sector, its business sector, is that word that we've heard so often so far from Minette and David this morning, resilience. In that business is generally very capable of adapting to whatever new circumstances are thrown at it. We've seen that over decades, not just over the past 2 or 3 years. So there is this resilience, the ability to adapt that I think we all in this room probably feel. When things, do you remember that word diversification that was the obsession in the sort of late 70s, early 80s? Well, how are farmers going to adapt to the new environment then? And everybody was thinking, well, should we build a golf course, or should we have a farm shop, or whatever? Now, we've moved on from those days now. But I think when you look at this new blueprint document that you've got in front of you today that's been produced, you start from an enormously positive position. You look at the opinion poll ratings at the beginning of that document, 88% of people see it's important that Britain has a good food producing industry. 84% support clearer labelling. 73% look specifically for British food. 75% trust British food more than foreign food. What a great place to start from. And I think that's where the government's got to build on. And you've got somebody as a Secretary of State for Defra who actually is a farmer himself. Now, that ought to be an advantage. I'm sure you've all got plenty. Remember that word ought. That ought to be an advantage. And look, it's in the government's interest to make a real success of this. They want suggestions from you. I mean, Minette was very good at, shall we say, criticising the government, and why not? There's plenty to criticise about. But you've actually got to provide the solutions as well. And if you provide a few solutions to government, you ought to be knocking at an open door.
Thank you, Iain. Sorry, I was just waiting for the applause there. Jimmy.
So I want to start by saying that, look, I think the NFU do a tremendous job. And the fact you've got George Eustace, former farmer, is an advantage. But, of course, you need to make the case to the whole of government and so on. And that is what Terry and Minette did very well when I was in number 10, coming in and seeing me and making the case and explaining things largely as they were, as Minette did this morning, which is not the case, I can assure you, for all kind of business lobby groups. And they didn't do, I don't say they did a good job just because Terry used to bring me a block of cheese to demonstrate British farming produce influence. Exactly. And there I'd be, getting back to my office afterwards, having to weigh the block of cheese and see how much on the website it would cost, because I was terrified that it'd be above the £12 declaration limit. And I kid you not, I made this joke at the time, Sue Gray will come and frog march me down if it's not. And so it seems rather closer to the truth now.
I think they've got bigger problems in number 10 these days. But
Well, now we know where all the cheese went.
Yeah.
So the point that I wanted to make about sort of technology and entrepreneurship and the way that society is changing is consumers are becoming much more aware of everything that they are purchasing. And there's no doubt that we are kind of living in a grand realignment moment off the back of Brexit and off the back of COVID. But there is a danger with that what ends up happening is the grand realignment ends up being everyone's grand reconfirmation of what I thought before those events happened. And there is a challenge with that is important to get across, that the challenges that British farmers are facing have been there for a number of years. Consumers are becoming more aware of where they're getting it. They can check these things through. And that, I believe, is a great opportunity for what everyone in this room is trying to do. But I do think there's an important argument about trying the way that you make these arguments and making them as public as possible. Because there are lots of ways that can be campaigning now. And one of the examples is to get out there on social media and explain what you are doing as a community. Because there is so much. I spent the last couple of weeks researching for today and doing a podcast of Jimmy's Jobs of the Future. And I interviewed this amazing farmers, Charles and Joe Mear, last week for it, who are working with Better Origin to do an AI insect, so artificial intelligent insect farm. And it is amazing when you listen to them and the passion that they speak about how this is helping the environment, about how this is also helping the animal welfare and makes the produce taste better at the end of it. And it's such a powerful argument that they make. And you have to get out there and kind of make that. One of the examples to do that via social media is there's a company near here called Gymshark that's a gym company, sportswear company. They have scaled over the last 10 years. So it was founded by a guy in his early 20s. It's now scaled to 1,000 people and is valued at £1.5 billion. He entirely did that at the beginning through social media and getting out there and kind of making the argument. Of course, he'd got good headwinds behind him. Fitness was improving, becoming more of a trend and so on. But that, for me, is one of the key things that needs to be done by everyone here, because you've seen the impact that things like Clarkson's Farm have had, and people talk about it. And it's getting out there and riding those tailwinds that I think are so important for people and for all of you in this room to be able to do. But of course, as you said, you always deal with uncertainty. There's been constant uncertainty for the last 15 years. It's been a financial crisis. I always used to think of it as my generation had my professional generation had three challenges of the financial crash, Brexit and the pandemic. And then, of course, I get here today and hear Dave Ramsden talk about the energy shock as well being that. And so it's inevitable. But the point that Iain makes is that the resilience that you have shown over the last couple of years has been amazing, particularly when the world stopped, doctors and farmers did not. You put food on the table of British people at one of the most hardest points to be able to do that. And so hats off to you.
Thank you, Jimmy. Thanks very much. Right, now to the first of two regulators we're going to hear from on the 2 days of conference. Tomorrow, Emma Howard-Boyd joins us from the Environment Agency, but today, Susan, Chair of FSA, different perspective to your colleagues on this panel, but how does the world look to you at the moment?
Well, a slightly different perspective, but everybody has reflected so much on the sort of turbulent times we are living in. I thought that I don't want to rehash those arguments. And so perhaps instead what I can do is to tell you a little bit about, I think, how FSA is trying to respond to that uncertainty and what I hope we can contribute working with you in the future. It has been just an extraordinary time. I arrived 6 months ago as chair of the FSA when they had already been through hugely challenging moments through the pandemic. And actually, I'm incredibly proud of the fact that FSA managed to maintain 100% service delivery on the official controls right through the pandemic. That was down to amazing contributions from our staff, and it was down to far, far better working with all of our partners, whether they were people in the food supply chain, whether they were people in government. We've upped the level of communication to a place which I think is very much better than it has been before, whether it's field, phone calls to our field staff, whether it's F4 meetings in government. And I think that's something we've really got to hang on to. The second thing we've been dealing with is the consequences of EU exit. And there's been an enormous return of food law to the UK. And thanks to my predecessor, Heather Hancock, the FSA was really set up in such a way that we were able to take back all of those laws and from day one ensure that we had safe food and we maintained the controls on food and animal feedstuffs. And that was down to planning. It really was. It was about planning and then adapting as you go. But as lots of people have said, farmers are better at dealing with uncertainty than almost any other profession. And I've been really reflecting on that more as I was preparing for this. And I think that we in the FSA really need to learn from you as we think about the future. So there are a few things that I think really matter. As farmers, you are absolutely focused on what your job is, and that is producing food and getting it on the table. And despite all the wind, side winds, the buffeting, actually, that's what people keep on doing, day to day, generation to generation. And I think we've got to stay focused on our core mission, which is about keeping food safe and making sure that people can trust that food is what it says it is. And I think we've got to remember that, despite everybody asking us to do 101 other things. If food's not safe, we've got a problem on our hands. The second thing is we've got to be forward-looking, and we've boosted up our surveillance capacity enormously so that we can respond, we can see food incidents when they arise, and we can respond to those very quickly. We can take early action to protect the public, and that's, effectively farmers checking, checking crops, checking animals every day, get onto problems before they turn into a crisis. And the third thing is that I think we have got to be agile in trying to respond to very fast-moving changes in the external environment, the economic environment for sure. And one of the most important ones for us right now, and certainly high on our agenda, is looking at the system for regulatory approvals for novel foods and feedstuffs, so that we really are there supporting innovation, making it easier for businesses to do things which are going to improve our food system. So next month, you'll see the Food Standards Agency put out its new strategy. And I hope that you'll see that those principles are really reflected in that. We will absolutely continue to do our very, very best to keep food safe. But what I think we also need to do is to remember that other part of our statutory responsibilities, which is reflecting the wider issues for consumers within government. And so I think what you'll see us doing is paying greater attention to some of the longer term risks in the food system and working with others inside and outside government to ensure we play our part to make food healthier and more sustainable so that we're securing the food supply for the long term. I'm absolutely convinced that the FSA that a strong FSA is good for farmers. We all want high standards for our food and feed, and I think having an effective regulator is a really important part of that. We are incredibly privileged to enjoy very high levels of consumer trust, and that's vital to the whole food system. But this is an uncertain time. We've heard that throughout the morning, and I think that's all the more reason why we have got to work together. I completely agree with Minette on that. I'll hold back from saying that we need a common plan, but for sure we need a common purpose. And I think the purpose that everybody in this room can agree on is that we want high food standards that producers and consumers can be really proud of. And I want to see the FSA continuing to work very closely with the NFU and others to make sure that that aspiration is a practical reality.
Susan, thank you very much. Now, we've got some questions starting to build in the audience, but do make yourself known to NFU colleagues who are here. And as I say, they'll pop up on my iPad. Now, let's get into some questions. And Jim, I threatened you with this earlier about the plan. Look, we saw the inflation figures last week, 5.5%. I'm not asking you to bring to life the whole plan, but I do want to touch on inflation. Minette referenced the agricultural cost index this morning, at over 18%. I shudder to think what it is today. I mean, that was November to November. Consumers are hurting, small businesses that can't set their own prices like the majority of farmers are hurting. So, that plan, if Rachel Reeves were Chancellor today and you were the Defra Secretary, what, if anything, would you be doing practically to help the people in this audience?
Well, I think there are two aspects. One is household inflation, so the everyday bills that we all receive, the costs of buying something in the supermarket, the cost of filling up your car, the upcoming tax increases that are going to hit in terms of national insurance, the personal tax allowance freeze, council tax going up and others. All that will impact on people's household bills that will provide more pressure down the supply chain even further. The thing that I'm worried about immediately, and we'll come on to what our plan looks like, is that the cost of living crisis becomes an excuse to drive down standards even further, because the consumer pressure to reduce the cost of the weekly shop will be so great that if we don't do something to support British business in the meantime, we won't be anywhere near competitive when the trade deals are being struck that could undermine it. The first thing that they could do is to resolve the labour issue. The cost of labour for many farms and many producers and distribution, I mean, the HGV driving crisis hasn't gone away, even though it's not in the news as much, is driven by the ideology that's withholding labour coming into the country for seasonal workers and for skilled workers when we talk about butchery skills. The government could resolve that today, but even their most recent attempt to do it, frankly, has been clouded with incompetence. It has. And this is why I say a plan's important. Now, I'm not saying that you can have a plan for every eventuality. You can't. The world doesn't work like that. But there are certain things that we know are coming our way and we know we need to plan for, that the government could have a plan in place for. I think the ELM scheme, for me, would be the easiest thing the government could do that's in their direct control. So what can the government do where they pull a lever and something happens on the other side of it? Well, the ELM scheme is entirely within the government's control. They determine how much money is in the pot, they determine how that pot is then distributed, and they determine the priorities and the criteria for allocating that money. Why, given that we've got Brexit still impacting on export markets, the trade deals that are potentially impacting over the next 12 months and further afield, while we've got the cost of living crisis and the cost of production crisis hitting businesses, why now take away the direct payments to farmers that would help them through that period? We found out today, I think it's reported, that there's a January surplus in the Treasury of over £2 billion of surplus in the public sector finance this month. There is money in the system to say to farmers, we can give you a bit of breathing space to go through this uncertain time on cost of living, on Brexit, coming through the pandemic, that will just give you a bit more time to settle. We'll then look to reform on a more transitional basis ELMS that helps with our biodiversity and our nature. For me, that would be a pragmatic thing to do. When I was a council leader in Oldham, an example matters in some of this because politicians can talk all day long. When I was a council leader in Oldham, my dad's a truck driver. I spent my childhood growing up in the passenger seat of his tipper truck. And so HGV drivers are my heroes. Apologies to farmers in the room. But we recognised at that time there was 50,000 HGV driver shortages even at that time. And so we brought forward a scheme as the council to say that we would fund the blue-collar licence to trade that was a bit that government wouldn't fund to get more HGV drivers through the scheme. But we wanted reliable people who had a proven track record in work to recognise that their hard work was being rewarded. Roll your sleeves up, work hard, you can get on in life. That was the principle of it. And so we said, if you've been working in a warehouse for 2 years or more and you've got a good reference from your employer, we will pay for you to become a HGV driver. The benefit? Straight away, they got a £7,000 annual increase even at that time. But you also freed up an entry-level job for somebody who was looking for work to come into the warehouse. There are schemes like that that you can do to make a practical difference. And within the space of a year, we got 150 drivers onto that scheme, just in a town like Oldham. Now, if the government had a bit more imagination, practical solutions to everyday problems, then we could achieve far more than we are. But frankly, I see a government, and I know this is a very political point, that is just completely void of any substance, void of any plan, just holding on to power for whatever's sake.
Okay. So look, Jim's just kicked off there talking about immigration particularly. Iain, I know Brexit was about taking control of borders, but do you think we've got our immigration policy right? I mean, we heard Minette this morning talking about being able to turn it on and off. You've, if you like, studied Brexit or kept an eye on it for the last 5 years, and you've seen, and I think you talked about, the plan hasn't survived the first contact with the enemy necessarily, and there's been some difficult headwinds to face into. But have we got immigration policy right?
If I never have to do a Brexit phone-in again on LBC, I should be very happy. No, they haven't got it right. I mean, I voted leave, but I didn't vote to leave on the basis of reducing immigration. In fact, I remember saying during the Brexit campaign, anybody that thinks that immigration is going to go down as a result of Brexit needs their head testing, because we need immigrants in this country in all sorts of different sectors. And Jim is right to the extent that I think there is too much ideology on this. Sort of, if you say you're going to reduce immigration, that is generally quite popular among the electorate. So therefore, you've got to, when you're in power, you've got to do something about it. But clearly, there are sectors in the economy that need workers that we're not getting at the moment. Social care being an obvious one. I mean, seasonal workers, particularly on fruit farms. I mean, I live on what used to be a fruit farm until the storms of 1987 when all the trees blew down. So I don't think they've got that right, and there needs to be a lot more accommodation of various sectors' needs. Farming is but one sector. There are many others that are experiencing shortages, so I think they do need to address that. Where I slightly part from Jim, though, is that, I mean, on the cost of living crisis, if this was just affecting this country and the government could pull levers, fine, but it's not. If you look at the inflation rate across Europe, actually across the world, and we are about middle in the league table of inflation rates in European countries at the moment. American inflation is now over 7%. Now, when inflation hit 15, 20% in the 1970s, the government at the time could pull levers because we didn't have this sort of globalized economy that we now have. So I do have a little bit of sympathy with them in the sense that I don't think they can do anything or do a lot themselves to affect the inflation rate. There are things that they can do, but you have to do these things in concert with other countries. And just because we're out of the European Union, that doesn't mean that we can't do things in concert with European countries.
Yeah. Jimmy, let me ask you, look, this is a question that came through online earlier, and look, we've all heard the Prime Minister talk about wanting a high wage, high skill, high productivity economy. You've heard Minette talk this morning, you've met farmers preparing for your podcast and so on. I mean, do you think this is affordable? This is that doctrine is really, really strong when you meet with Home Office and others. And, let's be honest, is it affordable? And more importantly, is it affordable to the people in this room?
I mean, I think it's a huge challenge. I mean, one of the things that I thought, listening to Dave Ramsden earlier, was he talked about the 500,000 people that are now missing from the labour market that weren't there pre-pandemic. And he sort of said, oh, well, they've probably sort of, either sick or, back in education. And I'm not totally sure that's true, but I do think there has been a bit of a shift in the last couple of years where a lot of people, partly because of Brexit as well, may have gone back to EU countries and sort of aren't absolutely desperate to kind of come back here. And there has been a moment of reflection for a lot of people. And I think there is a danger that we have that also with inflation, because we haven't had serious inflation for 10 years, and we haven't seen the levels of inflation at the moment for 30, there is a bit of sort of groupthink that is developing there, and I think that is a real challenge in Westminster and Whitehall for that. Of course, we want a high wage, high productivity economy, and what I've seen with a lot of what farmers are doing is doing exactly that, and actually diversifying into lots of new sectors, and it's amazing to kind of see that happening. So I think farmers will find a way, but we do live in a a new sort of economic paradigm as what we're finding at the moment. And the truth is we don't know how all this settles down at the moment, right? Because we're still sort of, it's just happened after it. But every 30 or 40 years, you get a big shift in the way that the British state interacts. And you can take that back right from the foundation of the Labour parties in the 1920s, 1940s, you had Attlee and the welfare state. 70s and 80s, Thatcher and the rolling back of the state. We are effectively now in that period. We are at that 30, 40-year horizon. Again, you've had Brexit, you've had COVID, and the truth is we don't know what the next 10 years holds.
So let me ask you then, you're still, I'm sure, well connected to Number 10. You'll have people that have succeeded you in the role of talking to business, and it's a big part of what happens in Number 10. What sort of conversations are they having, your successors, with British business at the moment? Specifically on labour, but more generally on inflation. I mean, this must be a pretty difficult time to be a business advisor in Number 10.
Yeah, I mean, yes, it was. I mean, I thought it was hard when I was there doing Brexit, but this is a whole new kind of kettle of fish. I think the challenge with it, and you heard it was one of the questions I asked of the Bank of England earlier, is about what food inflation will be towards the end of the year. And that used to be one of the key things that I would find out for the Prime Minister, that I would brief on, because it's quite, you can have all the data, but actually the question that I'd be trying to find out is the extra intelligence of what people think is going to happen. And I would put that in various briefing notes and so on. And I must say, if I were looking at it now, the dashboard of the UK economy when it comes to inflation, you've got warning lights all over the place. I mean, the phrase that was just uttered to me backstage was that we are facing triple-digit inflation in some areas. I mean, I had to do a double take to kind of make sure I'd heard it. I mean, that is crazy to be kind of using that language, and that just shows the sort of the dangers that are out there at the moment. And it will become a massive political issue, because as soon as people start getting poorer, they don't start voting for governments.
Susan, I'm not going to put you on the spot on labour, although you might have some views on the availability of vets and so on. But I suppose just reflecting on Jim's plan, your purpose, and one of the things that the members in this room get quite excited about is regulatory burden. And you're a regulator. I mean, Brexit was sold to the UK's electorate as a means of taking back control. When it comes to regulation, where and how can it be better handled? Is it Westminster? Is it Cardiff? Is it even more locally than that? And I think you're in a unique position as a fiercely independent regulator, maybe to give us some views on this.
Well, our first priority was to make sure that the systems would work, and so we essentially brought them back pretty well the way they'd been done in Europe. And we've now had, a year or so of running that system. I think they're bedded in. And as my colleagues in the agency will know, I've been tramping around saying, okay, now this system's working, how can we make it better? How can we be more efficient? How can we ensure that what we are doing as a regulator is not adding unnecessary costs? It's going to add some costs, but we've absolutely got to double down on making sure we're not making it more difficult than it needs to be. So that's one thing. In the regulated products arena, which is of particular interest to lots of people who are trying to bring, new innovation through. I think we need to do far more to work with businesses to help them know what they need to do to be able to go through the process, so they don't spend a whole load of time doing things that aren't important, so we get that streamlined. And that we really support businesses to make good applications into the system. We then handle them efficiently. We, as part of the Brexit Opportunities Command paper, have put into the Cabinet Office a list of things where we think that actually, with some changes in the legislation, we can, think things could be a bit easier. Whether that's, how we deliver official controls for meat, which will be of lots of interest to many of your members, right through to labelling. So I think there are opportunities. I don't think we've seized them yet, but we have at least identified them, and we're on the case.
So will you get to meet Jacob Rees-Mogg and go through those opportunities?
I think we have, maybe even have a meeting in the diary.
Excellent. Good, good. I think Manette's also written to him to ask for one of those. So
Can I be a fly on the wall on that one?
I think it isn't, one of the interesting things about Brexit and even about the pandemic is it's really brought home that food is so central to what matters to people. It touches their everyday lives multiple times every day. So when you hear about trade deals, what is it that actually the public are concerned about? It's food standards. When the pandemic starts, what are they concerned about? It's the food supply in the supermarkets. And I think if government hasn't learnt that food really matters and that we need to have a really strong, clear policy which delivers what people want from their food system, then that would be very disappointing. Certainly I came very independent, not very political, came into this job feeling like there was a window of opportunity right now where so many things had happened, where people recognised that this was a once in a lifetime opportunity to do things differently, and we've got to get it right.
hold that thought. Richard Blackburn, if you can find the microphone, please. And like I say, the reason I said hold that thought is because I wanted to ask you and Jim as well about the forthcoming food white paper. Maybe we'll start with you, Jim. I mean, you've mentioned the plan. You've got some very clear ideas on agricultural policy, but thinking about food more broadly or more holistically in your role as shadow spokesman, what are your hopes for the forthcoming food white paper?
Well, I mean, my starting point is about food security and access to food. It's inescapable not to look at the changes that have happened over the last 10 to 12 years and conclude that more people are struggling to eat a healthy, balanced diet. There are more people being sent to the food bank dependent on whatever they have in stock. There are more people who are reliant on food parcels during half-term. You know, frankly, while some MPs were spent being barristers abroad during the pandemic, I was out delivering food parcels to children because their parents couldn't afford to feed them during half-term. When I was giving out clothing parcels, the people who were coming were in social care uniforms. One was a nurse, people that were struggling to get by just a few days before payday. And so I really start at that point, really, which is that everybody should have access to good quality food. And I believe that British producers produce the best in the world. And so I want to make sure that we do as much as possible to make sure that we have a land use strategy, a financial incentive support scheme in place, and also that we have a coherent plan that really addresses some, and in a sense, I'm not criticising the government for deliberately kind of going out there to do farmers over. I'm not saying that at all. But I do blame them for not kind of seeing the unintended consequences of their action. So if we say to airlines or to other high-polluting industries that actually rather than going faster in decarbonisation, you can offset that carbon liability by investing through a City of London scheme to buy up farmland, to take away that production land, to plant conifer trees instead, without any planning, without any coordination, then you are going to have the unintended consequences that production land will be reduced, not because you deliberately set out to do it, but because you didn't have a plan that was in the round. And that's why I am critical of the government, which is that we now know the impact of some of these things, and we should be addressing some of that.
That sounds like quite an interventionist policy in terms of the operation of this. You've referred to quite a lot of markets there, land market, markets that Manette's referred to in terms of particularly carbon and so on. Is that what you're proposing?
Well, and the challenge, and I'm hoping that when George Eustace does come, he's honest with the farming community about, listen, the carbon, the natural habitats, the biodiversity, the need to reduce pollution is on everybody's shoulders in this room as much as it is on the aviation industry or anybody else. You know, we're really clear that we have an ambition to have clean air, clean water, and a clean natural habitat. And we do need to support farming to be able to modernise work practices, to be able to reduce pollution, in particular the pollution into watercourses, but rather than doing that in a punitive way, to make sure that the transitional support is in place. So we've announced already, Rachel Reeves has announced, £28 billion of investment every year till the next election on decarbonisation, on that climate transition, and farming will be critical to that. So there'll be a proper plan in place with support of financial money, of cash in place to make sure that that transition is managed.
Susan, I don't know whether you're allowed to talk about the white paper, but you were certainly on Henry Dimbleby's advisory panel, and that's clearly a big part of what's being fed in now to the government machine as colleagues in Defra think about what's in the white paper, and we should see it next month. But any thoughts that you can offer on this?
Well, I think it's very clear, as Jim said, consumers want safe food, they want healthier food, and they want more sustainable food. And we're seeing in all of our consumer surveys that the proportion of people looking for the food system to deliver on all of those objectives is going up year on year. And our food strategy, our food system has got to make it easier for consumers. We can't expect them to be going into the supermarket and having to work out where this has been sourced and, you know, what its eco-credentials are and how much fat and sugar and salt is in it. We need the food system to have made that as good as it can be before it gets there. We need a plan to do that. And we need government to have much clearer, much more joined up asks of the food system. You know, I'm absolutely aware that you're being buffeted by requests from different government departments for different things. And everything can't be a priority all of the time. And so I think the white paper is an opportunity to really set that out, to be clear what we're trying to achieve, to be clear what the trade-offs are, and to have that, you know, to have that conversation. One obvious thing which has come up already today, which is about public procurement. If we cannot get public procurement of food right, so that it's not only delivering on those values that we think are important, it's kind of role modelling them, but it will also, because the public purse is such a big purchaser of food, actually it will start to shape the system. Because that's what's being demanded. We saw this in school food. When the school food standards came in, industry responded by producing products that met the standards. So I think if we can get public procurement right, that will be good for British food production. It will be good for maintaining more sustainable production methods. And that feels to me like it's a really important place to start. We've got some government buying standards and so forth. The problem is they're not monitored in any way whatsoever. And, you know, if you have standards without any scrutiny, effectively they're just a bit of guidance. Yep. And so I think if we're serious about about a good food system, we could start with public procurement. That is a lever that government can pull, and we can make sure we monitor it and ensure that it's happening in practice.
Look, that'll be a very popular policy in this room, that public procurement, particularly where we're seeing standards raised at home, and then FTAs with potentially lower standards coming in on imports. I think the prevailing view in this room is that government should practice what it preaches when it comes to buying its own food. Richard Blackburn.
Thank you. Richard Blackburn, Cheshire. And thank you, Terry, for already covering off my question. But I'll give it a go anyway, because I'd actually took the time to listen to Jimmy's podcast the other day, but it was a very wet and windy day, in which egg farmer Charles Muir, who he mentioned before, who has embraced innovation, said there's not much in it for him and he needed the egg price to go up. My question is to the panel, when our government seems hell-bent on high-wage, high-technology economy, what prospect does this leave for farm and horticultural businesses that are often price takers and not price makers in the food supply chain? Thank you.
Well, as tempting as it is to go to the presenter of that podcast first, we haven't heard from Iain Dale for 5 minutes. So essentially the question was, it's almost a repetition of the one earlier around high-skill, high-wage economy. Charles Muir, who was the farmer on Jimmy's podcast the other day, basically was saying, look, I'm investing in this innovation, I'm really taking this business forward, I've really heard what consumers want in terms of environmental credentials and so on, but frankly, the price of eggs has got to go up, and I'm really hurting. So against that sort of political wish, I suppose, that we move to that economy, it's collided with reality, and a really top-notch entrepreneur that would be the envy of lots of the people in this room is really, really struggling with that high-wage economy.
And I think that he will speak for a lot of people throughout the economy on that. And I mean, the one thing that Susan didn't mention in her list of things that consumers are looking for is they want cheapness. They don't want to pay the requisite price. I mean, we see it with milk. We see it with eggs. I mean, there'll be a lot of families on the breadline that can order chicken for £1, whereas, I mean, a normal cost ought to be multiples of that. So I think that is a challenge, not only for producers, it's a challenge for government. And of course, if they work out, if all the polling and focus groups tell them that cheapness trumps all of the other things that you mentioned there, Susan, then there is a clash between the producers and the consumers and indeed the regulators. And it's very difficult to see what the solution to that is. I mean, you presumably have to look at it on each individual product level. And I mean, I think we're all familiar with the milk price problem. And, well, we all know what the solution is. The effing supermarkets, don't we? I mean, if they actually paid a proper price, then the consumer would have to pay a bit more, which will then add to inflation, and then we get into the whole vicious circle again. So I don't know what the solution is. I mean, that's what we pay George Eustace to do, isn't it? Come up with a solution.
Thanks, Iain, and a shout out to all our retail colleagues here in the room with us today. Jimmy, you spoke to Joe and Charles. They're an inspirational couple, but I mean, you heard Richard's question. I mean, reality has collided with the policy there, hasn't it?
Oh yeah, I mean, totally. But I think it's a, how do you explain this? I thought Minette's point this morning around the kind of coffee example is a great one, right? Like, I did it this morning, got a coffee from Pret, $3.75 or whatever. I can go across the station concourse to Boots and buy a meal deal for the same thing, which will include chicken, bacon, bread, butter. You think about the supply chain of what has gone in to create that meal deal over what has happened with the cup of coffee. It is extraordinary, and I think that needs to be. It needs to be explained. The work that goes into these things is enormous. And that's where you've got a really kind of complex task with some of this, because we've got so used to it. We've got so used to be able to buy these things on a cheap basis. And it's a really difficult and it's a painful argument to make, because you're going out there and you're saying that consumers should be paying more for it. And that is hard with all the stories that Jim also puts forward about food banks and so on. So it completely collided with reality. But there are amazing stories about, the way they're using the insects and the artificial intelligence. I was blown away by on that. It's really, really impressive stuff.
Yeah, absolutely. Look, I can't, having promised to ask you about Derby County, and look,
do I get to speak about West Ham?
Do they need saving as well?
Yeah. So many ways.
So look, how I'm going to ask you this is, look, we've run fantastic grassroots campaigns the last few years in this organisation. You're in the middle of one at the moment. You've been on the receiving end of them as well when you were in number 10. And I suppose, look, we're feeling our way as an organisation, as an industry, because it's become a really important part of our arsenal in terms of lobbying, because without those campaigns, people simply weren't listening to us. So just for the members here today, and reflecting a little bit on your experience with Derby County, what makes it a great campaign? And, wearing your old number 10 hat, what are the pitfalls? What should we look out for? Well,
so for those who don't know, Derby County on the verge of extinction. I began to realise this in mid-January, that this was going to be an issue that nobody was really taking, the national agenda wasn't really noticing, because it had been so long running. So I basically put my shoulder to the wheel to make as much noise as possible and matched it up the political agenda. It's what I call my 2-year-old toddler music strategy. There wasn't a lot in it, it was just make as much noise as quickly and as loudly as possible. And so I'd learned from the best. What makes it is making it relative to other people, right? And that was the bit that really kind of like began to take off, was when I started sort of tweeting about, Derby County is older in existence than the Eiffel Tower or the Statue of Liberty. And I put pictures of those things up as well. Are we really going to let this go to the wall, an extinction, over some financial irregularities and so on? We've been docked a lot of points, by the way. And it's making it relative, right? And it's making that argument which does it. And I was really impressed with Minette this morning making the point about the kind of Ukraine crisis. And I thought, well, where's this going to go? And then bang, 30% of global exports of wheat do it. And that's what you've got to do. You know, you've got to see what's in the news agenda and how you make these things, and that's how it kind of works in its most impactful way. And you know, I think we'll get there, because never overestimate the knowledge of politicians, sorry Jim, or the media, sorry Iain, because there's a lot going on in the world at the moment, as we've all talked about today, and whilst you will know everything about your issue and it will be very important to you, it will not be on the kind of national agenda. And so that's what you've got to do. You've got to make your stuff relevant for that.
Thanks. Are you going to be successful?
Yes, I think we are. And amazingly, Rooney might actually keep the team up. It's turning out to be quite an incredible story.
Iain?
Jimmy's absolutely right, and I think with any campaign, you've got to first of all keep it local. Tip O'Neill said all politics is local. How many of you have not invited your local MP to your farms, for example? You should do. Because if you're running a campaign on any issue, and I used to be, hesitate to admit it, a lobbyist. If you run a campaign, you've got to win over hearts and minds. You've got to build coalitions. It's not all about logic. It is heart as well as head. And a campaign I ran in the 1980s to persuade the Thatcher government to get rid of the Dock Labour scheme, which, I mean, sounds a bit of an esoteric thing, but we managed it because we got a whole load of other sectors outside the ports and shipping industry to support it. And we were able to persuade them, well, if you do this, there'll be 50,000 extra jobs. And I think the farming sector is ahead of any other sector in the economy, because I think most people in the country, most politicians will think positively about the farming sector, about the stewardship of the countryside as well as food production. You don't get that in the chemical industry, frankly, so you have a head start on anybody else. And I think if you get the campaigning right, the marketing right, you can actually win a lot of pluses. And you've got someone as your president who's willing to knock down a few doors. And that's important as well. So I think you are in a really good position to make progress if there is the willingness in Parliament to listen. And I mean, politics is a funny thing. My dad, my parents, who were farmers, they always said that they always wanted a Labour government because they always did better under a Labour government in the farming sector, but they always still voted Conservative, bizarrely. So you could be knocking at an open door as well.
That's true. Thanks, Iain. Look, NFU Conference is all about members, and I've just spotted we just talked about advocacy, and I've spotted a very strong advocate for British agriculture down the front here. I'm hoping, although this isn't one of the 4 mics that we referred to earlier, I'm hoping that this mic at the front will work, and we can hear from Sarah Bell very quickly before we wrap up.
Hello, Sarah Bell, Council Member for Leicestershire, Northampton, Rutland. A question to Susan. The last thing the industry needs at this point is a food scare. We all know trust arrives on foot and leaves on horseback. I am very concerned about the lack of border control around imports from Europe, and I see that as a real point of weakness in our food system at the moment. How do you see that being addressed over the next 2 to 3 years? And also to Jimmy, how do you see the world of technology, broadband and artificial intelligence being something that potentially helps us with spotting these food scares well in advance and making sure they don't actually erode the trust between the public and the food system?
Brilliant questions, but you've only got 30 seconds to answer them.
Okay, so border controls, obviously the laws are set and we're there just to enforce the law, but pre-notification is already in place, of course, for things coming from outside the EU, and it will start coming in for high-risk products from within the EU this summer. I have to say I'm not specifically worried about it. We've been, that we know there are mostly pretty high standards there in relation to safety. We've done a huge amount of work to maintain, to establish our intelligence networks. And so the work we're doing at Borders is very intelligence-led and risk-based. So we're focusing on the highest risk things. And it's a tiny example. It's not about animal feed. It's not about human feed. But we've just taken action to stop the import of some mice, feeder mice. So people were feeding their reptiles, which we knew had high risk of having salmonella. And we've actually been able to stop them being imported at all. It's not the most relevant example, but it shows we're on the case, and we will continue to be, because as I hope I've said many times, if consumers lose confidence in food safety, then we have all lost and we won't be able to do anything else.
Jimmy.
So I think it's basically going to get better and better, some of the technology that's happening, some of the things that we're going to be able to do in terms of prediction of weather and so on is improving all the time. So overall, I think it's going to be a positive. The one thing I'd say about technology at the moment is it's not very clear where the trend is. For the last 20 years, there's been decades where you've been able to sort of see the advance of the computer, the advance of the smartphone. What the challenge with the next 10 years is not very easy to see what is going to be the dominant shift, because actually there's a lot about the metaverse and so on, and that is just not really kind of there for the next 30 years. And that's partly because there's no idea of what's going on. But I just wanted to say, like, you know, Iain, I've sort of suggested you should be on social media. Iain's partly suggested you should be part-time lobbyists as well. I appreciate how much farmers do, but one of the reasons I found it so fascinating doing the podcast with you over the last couple of weeks is that you are accountants, you are marketeers, you are entrepreneurs, you are all of these things, part-time lawyers as well. And it's so inspiring to kind of see all of the work that you do, and you should be incredibly proud, and I just encourage you to make your argument. You do great jobs through the NFU, but also as well on an individual basis. That really makes a difference with politicians because it's stories that move them.
Thank you, Jimmy. And look, I've got to do my AGM address tomorrow. One of the things that I will be talking about tomorrow is the fantastic, unique partnership that I'm lucky enough to work within, which is that we partner our professional staff with authentic and real people from farming businesses, and it makes a massive difference. And to Iain's point, lots of industries don't do it. So please continue to work closely with whichever of your local representatives that you have. Ladies and gentlemen, it is lunchtime, and I need to get 1,400 of you through lunch in an hour and 8 minutes so that you can come back and listen to the Secretary of State at 2 o'clock. Lunch is served in Hall 3. But before you go, please put your hands together for our amazing panel, Jim McMahon, Iain Dale, Jimmy McLoughlin and Susan Jebb.